Hello and welcome to the Research Connection podcast, the show that brings current expertise and cutting-edge research and connects it with users in the community.
Where are you calling from, Richard?
Well, I'm calling from Ditch Lake. Now,
Okay.
beautiful.
Jackie, you know where that is?
I do, but not for any good reason. I just had a friend who was looking at property up around that area.
It's a terrific spot.
Should we get started? My name's Michelle Lamb. I'm the director of BU CARES. CARES is the Center for Aboriginal and Rural Education Studies.
And I'm Jackie Kirk, and I'm the chair of the Department of Leadership and Educational Administration and co-host of the podcast.
And we should mention too that both of us come from fairly rural prairie places. So I grew up in Foxwarren, Manitoba, which is a town of about 50 people, maybe. Little town. We have the coldest drink in all of Manitoba, I'm told. And I believe it after being there. So that's where I grew up. And so I'm really interested in the topic of rural mental health and men's mental health. And I think that it's a really interesting topic. I'm glad we're here talking about this.
And I grew up in Climax, Saskatchewan, on a farm outside of Climax. So Climax has at the time that I was in high school, it had about 150 people, I think. It's shrunk a little bit. But
that's why I hesitated when I said Foxthorn had 50 people. I don't even know if they still have that many. Maybe they do, but I don't know. So Rachel, who are you? Could you introduce yourself to us?
So I'm a professor at Brandon University in the Department of Geography and Environment, and I'm a health geographer by trade, which means I'm really interested in how our environments, our communities, social and physical influence our health. I hold a Canada Research Chair in Rural and Remote Mental Health, and I'm the founding director of the Center for Critical Studies of Rural Mental Health. But before all of that, like you guys, I grew up in a rural place. My dad is still farming, though at a smaller scale than when I was a kid. So I grew up on a farm, a beef feedlot at the time. Now my dad switched to a cow and calf operation because he has a lot of joy that comes from seeing that. And I guess for me, in terms of understanding mental health, there are various people in my life who I've been close to, who have different experiences of mental illness and mental health. That sort of drives my interest in this topic particularly.
Well, first and foremost, I am a rural person now living at Ditch Lake, but I've been a mental health advocate for probably 4 or 5 years. However, I've been working all my life with a mental illness. It's quite possible that I could have been diagnosed in my teens, but I actually didn't start getting support until I was in my 40s. So, and then from that period of time, it took me probably a decade and a half to be able to really kind of coordinate my life so that I feel very, very mentally healthy, if you want to put it that way. And I'm very comfortable talking now about my previous experience and how I look at mental health and how I actually look at society looking at mental health. I was quite fortunate that I got a chance to meet Rachel when she was doing a study on men's rural health. And then from there, we've maintained a really nice relationship, and I'm part of the consumer advocate for the Center for Critical Studies of Rural Mental Health.
So could we talk a little bit about how men's mental health is unique?
Well, I think what I'd like to do is I'd like to do a little bit of definitions in relationship to what mental health and mental health illness is. And I say that because, of course, during the period, I know we'll talk about this a little bit later about COVID-19, but it seems to me that we're really hearing a lot the past few years about mental health and mental health is health and all these different things. Well, someone who has, I think a good way to look at it is that everyone can have good mental health or they can have poor mental health. And it depends really situationally on their ability to be able to have a balanced life and be able to cope with things, the normal stressors that happen in life. And I think that that's probably a good way to put it, that it used to be that mental health was considered the absence of a mental illness. So they don't do that anymore. So now what they really understand is the people with good mental health, they can be sad, they can be angry, they can have all the emotions that really they're supposed to have. And that's part of living the life as a human being. It's not an either or situation where you have to be feeling good. You don't have to be feeling good all the time. The good part is that you're able to balance and be able to understand the things that you can control and the things that you can't control. And for me, that's really been one of the real keys, is that I can understand the stresses of life and I can work within those parameters and feel comfortable. So my life isn't being disadvantaged in any way by how my brain is working.
I think that's really important groundwork for Richard, and I want to thank him for really articulately communicating something that I find quite difficult to communicate, which is how do we understand mental health to begin with? And I think part of why I asked Richard to be the guest in this podcast is because basically anything that I say in this podcast is based on the experiences of men who are willing to share their stories, like Richard. And so we call that lived experience, and we increasingly recognize that if we're going to define mental health, if we're going to understand men's particular experiences of mental health, we actually need to talk to people who have lived experience. And while Richard might not like being called an expert, I think it's important that we recognize that he is, as he's told me, an expert in his own mental health. And so I feel, somewhat uncomfortable in a way on this podcast with him because, one, I'm a woman. Who am I to talk about men's mental health experiences? I have talked to a lot of men over the last few years, particularly, focused on this research question and the question that you posed about, why men. So I can speak to what the research says, and there's a few things that I would like to get across, but I also am curious always about, how does the research actually communicate with the person with lived experience? That's what's kind of cool about this conversation that we're having here today, is we actually get to have a conversation between the research and that lived experience. So I can say, okay, in general, men report lower levels of stress and depression, and that's, people who do large population surveys have discovered that there's this kind of paradox that there are these lower reports of stress and depression, but men, and particularly rural men, have been found to be 3 to 4 times more likely to complete suicide. And so suicide rates are higher among rural men in comparison to urban men and in comparison to rural women. And so that suggests that there's something about gender that's influencing that particular phenomenon. And so researchers have done some surveys that have allowed them to look at how men endorse or internalize stigmatizing views, that they tend to be more likely to internalize these sort of negative associations with poor mental health. They tend to be less likely to seek support, and they often actually express mental health differently. So they may be more likely to engage in drinking, or what sometimes researchers refer to as risk-taking behaviors, rather than maybe some of the emotions that we associate with, or emotional expressions that we associate with poor mental health. So I can speak to that as a researcher. I'm wondering, Richard, if there's anything you would add to that.
Sure. Probably very good time to talk about stigma a little bit. I spend a lot of time reading articles and looking at social media, and one of the things that happened with me was that when I first became ill, I became very ill because I did not reach out. And I did not reach out because of the stigma, but the stigma was more of a self-stigma. It wasn't a stigma that was directed towards what I thought. Perhaps it did a bit in general in terms of what people thought about mental illness, but it was really a tremendous shame and guilt that I had done something wrong. And you become distorted. When you're ill, your brain is distorted and your thoughts are distorted, so that you don't have the opportunity to look at it from a distance. You are literally in it so severely that it's almost like you can't move. And so I was basically broken. I didn't go for help. I did get some help, but really it wasn't until a period of time where I had gone to a couple of EAP settings and met a couple of people, and I had absolutely no desire to talk to these individuals. And then I came upon one gentleman who really, we hit it off, and I finally told him my true story. And when I actually told him my story, then I got to see staff, psychiatrist the very next day. And that was the start of my journey of getting better. But I did not seek out help. I literally did the best I could during the day, and I was working at the time, but I was so ashamed of what was happening with my brain. And again, the distortion really makes you think that you should be better. What's wrong with this picture? You look at other people and you see them as being probably normal, would be a great way to put it. I would see other people, I would think of them as normal, and I would think of myself as not being normal, not being contributing to society. And I think that stigma thing is a really big deal. And I certainly fit the men's piece of self-stigma where I would not, and I did not reach out to anyone.
Rachel, in the research, the experiences that Richard is describing, is that pretty common for men?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to Richard's experience. It's hard to certainly the experience of stigma and the challenges of navigating our healthcare systems and social support. I think we can say generally that they are that challenging. I'm always struck when I hear Richard talk about, having this experience that really started quite early on in life, and then being in his 40s before he actually got the support that he needed. I think people are positioned differently. Some people are able to get help sooner, but that I always find that part of Richard's story really, really shocking, but not necessarily uncommon.
And I want to ask about the rural piece too. That is it a compounding factor that the men are experiencing some of this stigma and the hesitation to reach out, like Richard described, and the rural location, I'm sure, also is a big factor. So could you speak to that a little bit, how the rural experience is different than in an urban setting?
Rural places are unique in a lot of different respects. As a geographer, I have studied how rural places are culturally different, and both geographers and sociologists, other researchers, sometimes characterize rural places as having a sort of culture of silence around mental health, that then further contributes to the kind of stigma that Richard talked about. But that culture is really, especially in, say, agricultural communities, there is often a lot of emphasis on stoicism and strength and working hard. And I think what I can pick up on in Richard's story is this sense of the need to contribute and not contributing enough, and really that sort of self-stigma. Richard was contributing and many of these men are contributing. They're working really hard. They're running massive operations, for example. And yet there's this feeling that they're not. And so it's that sort of cultural piece is a really big part of it. But there are other factors as well in terms of resources, right? So rural places tend not to have the same kind of health resources, specifically when it comes to mental health, right? The majority of specialists are centralized in urban centers. And also we might think about other kind of resources. So our health resources aren't just our health resources in the sense of formal health resources. We also know that our health resources are support networks, our friends. Well, if the majority of your friends are moving away for work in the city, then that kind of depletes your immediately accessible social support network. Or maybe there's fewer businesses or recreational facilities. And for men in particular, work is often a strong part of their identity, and a strong part of their ability to make social support systems, right? Is the guys at work, so to speak. And so when rural businesses decline, that can have a really direct impact on mental health. So those are some of the things that make rural locations unique. I know Richard has also been doing some work actually now that he's moved to a rural location, and he's been trying to run some support groups. So maybe he could speak about some of that and the challenges he's experienced.
That's true. The rural experience is very interesting, and it can happen in the city as well. But I'm straightforward when I talk about the fact that, let's go back to stigma again. Part of stigma is really related to what other people say in just general conversations. So they don't think about it. They don't think about the fact that maybe they're walking down the street and they're just joking about somebody who just went crazy, or they'll use different terms, or quite frankly, there'll be people who are unkind to other people, just in general. And that, quite frankly, that's part of stigma, is the fact that we're not, if you're not kind as a person, you're not going to be able to think, understand, and appreciate what a true mental health issue is. You're not going to, there's that whole thing of, let's just say with depression, well, everybody gets depressed, get over it. Honestly, if you haven't lived it, you don't have an idea of how profoundly frightening it can be. So I think in rural areas, I mean, I did start a peer support group. I've done peer support groups before, but one of the things that we found, among other things, was that in small towns, people are especially, they simply, it's far easier to suffer in silence than to let someone else know that you're looking for support. And so if you go to a church, you know, if the group is in a church, people are going to walk by and see those vehicles, and then they're going to have that perceived notion that there's something wrong with you. And if you're needing mental health supports, you're going to think that there's something wrong with you. The flip side of that is that I have found that if you get an opportunity to be able to run peer support groups, and there are peer support groups that run in Brandon, there's a tremendous upside to be sitting in a room with people and not being judged.
And in light of everything that's happening in the world because of COVID-19, is COVID-19 having an impact? And do you see that happening on mental health and in rural areas in particular?
I think it's a little bit too new for us to know, but I think, and I'd had an opportunity to talk to Rachel about this, I believe that people who have been dealing with mental health issues and have been dealing with mental illness are far more prepared than other individuals in relationship to COVID-19. I certainly, and to just use myself as an example, my balance, and you can imagine taking the years it did for me to actually get well, that took a tremendous amount of patience. That took a tremendous amount of, actually a lot of insecurity, because of the resources didn't naturally come. So when this first started, I'm very aware, and I'll social distance, but I do not get caught up into the anxiety of it. And I didn't at all. It just simply, okay, what is it that I can do? What can I control? I can control my thoughts, and on a day-to-day basis, understand that it is going to change, that it simply is something that is a kind of a moving target, and I need to be prepared to move with that. And that would be another thing that I would relate with mental health and mental illness. There are many, many times that you have so many challenges, and that could be with different medications, that could be seeing different people, or all sorts of things. You really learn how to roll with the changes that'll come up. But I do hope that all the people who are experiencing the anxieties and the difficulties now, I do hope that there may be a sense of their understanding mental health concerns and mental illness a little bit better, that there'll be more empathy, because they'll realize that in their own lives that they can't control what's going on.
I think that's a great point, and I really love that you're seeing the things that you went through and are still going through as a source of strength, or a place that other people can learn and draw from.
I guess I would add to your observation that certainly, resilience doesn't come without adversity. And so people like Richard, who have the experience that he has had, have over time developed resilience, not resilience as an individual trait, but in terms of the resources that they have, strategies that they've developed, support networks that they've developed, and so on. And so when I first started talking with Richard, I reached out to him about COVID-19 after we'd finished a report on our rural men's mental health study. And we were really kind of worried about, these men that we talked to, and, what we don't really know how people are experiencing COVID-19. We have some early studies that are we have polls, and we have some surveys that say, okay, it looks like people are experiencing greater levels of anxiety, trauma, depression, and some of these have targeted, say, healthcare workers, for example, and that's really important. But I do have concerns about the continuing care needs of people who are living with a mental illness in rural areas. I hope that Richard is right, that they're drawing on some of the strategies that they've developed. I also really hope that his message about what our broader community response should be in terms of learning to be more empathetic, learning to be more flexible, accepting change is going to have an impact on the culture around mental health, right? That, we keep hearing, this is the new normal, this is the new normal, COVID-19. I don't think COVID-19 is the new normal, but I really hope it's an opportunity to challenge the way that we have responded in the past and to respond differently in the future. And I just really hope that we take up Richard's challenge.
Jackie, I see big nods coming from your direction.
Well, I really like the way that you described it, Richard. That you've given a very nice description that helps me to really frame it and to understand it more thoroughly. I also really like that you've framed it in a way that shows the skill of, that it's something that people can work through and work for and develop skills for coping, which, all of us need. And I like the idea of balance, because that's what we don't do well. And I think in terms of COVID-19, that's one of the things we're going to have to learn to do better.
I have one last question for Richard, and Rachel, you're welcome to chime in too. You mentioned in sharing your story in your introduction that it took quite a few years, but eventually you found one person that felt safe enough for you to tell your true story, I think is how you said it. So my question is, what characteristics did that person have that made them feel so safe for you? And how can we be like that person as we're trying to advocate, or we're trying to be safe for the people in our lives?
That's an excellent question. I'm going to get on my soapbox with just a little bit of a rant right now. Because of COVID-19, it's very important there is a social distancing, and now we're using technology to try and help and support people. I am very afraid that is going to be considered more of a way, an easier way how to deal with it, rather than going back to have the face-to-face contact with people. Because it was really the persona of that person, the face-to-face. I've probably met 4 people in my lifetime who I trusted. And to get better, you can't simply, I know there's a lot of times you hear the end stigma or stop stigma or all this stuff. They're simply words, but they can translate, and how they translate is by providing those resources that are the face-to-face, where people can talk and not feel judged and realize that somebody cares, and you don't have to take it on yourself. And so in my lifetime, I've had about 4 people, including one time where I was in crisis, and I was fortunate to be able to chat with someone, and she was a clinician, and she was extremely good at her job, and I can't imagine not having seen her, because her ability to understand and not judge, but not even really to empathize, but just to really listen was absolutely wonderful. So technology is fine, but no, you're not going to, people who need supports, those face-to-face supports are really, really important. I've talked to Rachel about this before. I have no idea when it was that I actually found my voice. But once I found my voice, I realized it's not only is it okay, but by sharing, again, that whole community thing that Rachel talks about, we really need to get better and have a better understanding, so we can have more relaxed conversations. Because I think for men, they're not going to simply talk unless they can trust the individual, and to trust the individual, that person has to have knowledge, they have to have insight into an illness, and they have to have a compassion and empathy. So.
Well, thank you so much for being willing to share your story with us and to share your expertise and all the things that you're doing with advocacy and leading support groups. Thank you for taking the time to come and be on this episode. We appreciate it, and I've enjoyed this conversation. And to you too, Rachel, thank you for taking the time to be here and to share.
Thank you for listening to the Research Connection podcast. You can visit our website for links to everything that was mentioned in the episode. And for more Research Connection content at www.brandonu.ca/bu-cares. Be sure to rate and subscribe so you can stay up to date with current research that impacts your community. Thank you.